Welcome to the 71st episode of our Crossing Thin Ice podcast series, where twice a month we tackle risk management topics. I'm Max Rudolph, and today my partner Dave Ingram will expand on the topic ORSA rides the elevator. We're focusing on key elements of the NAIC regulatory requirement Own Risk Solvency Assessment Report provides an individualized tool for strategic decision making. Not surprisingly, communication plays a key role as the risk team filters the most important learnings to senior management and the board. Our aim for these Crossing Thin Ice offerings is to help with your ERM program and general risk knowledge. We encourage you to share with anyone interested in lifelong learning about risk management, and we welcome your feedback. As a reminder, nothing in today's podcast is intended to be investment advice. We are here to provide educational material on risk topics without getting lost in the weeds. Let's get started.
You just poured thousands of hours into your company's own risk and solvency assessment, the ORSA. It's a 75-page compliance document, an organizational monster. And now you have to present it to the executive team, the board, or a rating agency analyst. How do you communicate all that effort without them completely glazing over on page 3? The secret? You just don't. You hit them with an elevator pitch. We're talking 2 core sentences. If they're getting off the elevator on the next floor, you've already delivered the most important message. If they stay on the elevator, you have 3 more minutes to drop the details. Today, we're throwing out that 75-page presentation and learning how to distill all that critical risk work into a 90-second high-impact conversation. For too long, we've let the ORSA become a box-checking exercise, a burden of compliance. But the ORSA actually creates one of the most powerful communication opportunities you have to show the strategic value of your entire ERM program. So what are those 2 foundational sentences you need to start with? And what's the one crucial point that most ORSA reports miss? Let's go back into that elevator. You do not have any time to waste. The CEO is standing right next to you. You have about a minute and a half. If you worked on the ORSA report, you likely feel that you need to tell a long story to reflect all the effort that went into it. In this situation, you don't have time for a long story, though. You must land your core message instantly. Here are the 2 key sentences. Ready? First, we looked each of our most dangerous risks in the eye and found that we would survive any realistic disasters that they might cause. And second, we have a lively risk management system that will keep things that way and will keep us informed as the risks change and as our risk-taking changes. That's it. Everything else in your ORSA report, all 75 pages of it, are details that support those 2 crucial points. And if your listener is away on the next floor, you've done your job. You've made your point. Now let's assume that they press the button for floor 8. They're intrigued by your first 2 sentences, and you have about 3 more minutes to embellish that message. They need details, but they don't need the whole story. Remember that. The key here is to transition from the survival statement to how you tested that survival. This is where you talk about the stress test, the realistic disaster. You need to be ready with 3 or 4 sentences that expand on that survival statement. First, you describe the disaster you found that was the most troubling. Not the most improbable, but the most troubling. Second, tell them exactly what the company had left after the losses from that disaster and why that remaining capital is enough for the company to continue with the business plan. That's your risk appetite statement, by the way. Third, explain how your risk management activities helped reduce losses under that extreme scenario. And finally, briefly explain which risk management activity is actually the most significant to achievement of the company's goals in that scenario. By focusing on a real troubling scenario and what the company has left after it, you shift the focus from the risk of insolvency, which is what the regulators care about, to the practical value of risk management supporting company objectives and keeping the lights on when there's a troubling incident. We've covered survival and testing, and there's one more addition you can make to your elevator speech, a point that is often missing from a compliance-focused approach to the ORSA discussion. It's the concept of fit. The most common request I've heard from insurer management teams is that ERM and ORSA should have some practical value to the management process. That practical value comes down to one thing: the alignment of risk management with strategy. Does the ERM program fit? Think of it like trying on a new suit. With a suit, you can see if it fits in a moment. Assessing the fit of a core management process like ERM requires living with it for several quarters at the very least. So your final thought in the elevator should be a statement about the fit of the ERM program to the rest of the company operations. Because no matter how great the findings of your stress tests are, if the ERM program doesn't fit the company culture and its strategic objectives, it will eventually be abandoned and higher risk-taking will result. The ORSA provides this opportunity to communicate that fit. So let's recap those 3 core takeaways for your high-impact ORSA presentation. First, your pitch starts with the 2-sentence core. We survive realistic disasters, and our ERM program keeps it that way. Second, expand on the most troubling disaster by showing what capital is left afterwards, proving resilience. And third, always finish by linking the ERM program back to the strategic objectives and communicating the fit. This approach transforms your ORSA reporting from a mandatory compliance checklist into a powerful strategic conversation about the company's future.
If you're in an elevator and somebody important gets on that you want to explain why you're doing ORSA, they may only be on for 1 or 2 floors, so you better have something ready that's quick. With that as the context, how do you determine what your most dangerous risks are that you're gonna share with this important stakeholder?
Sure, and in the article I mentioned, you should be making a couple statements about your aggregate risk position, which is the ultimate test of the thing being tested in the ORSA. But then the secondary discussion, if they're going beyond the 2 floors or something, would be to delve into some of your most dangerous risk. I like that word because it's. I determine it when I've worked with companies, help them determine it by the stress tests that we do. One of the parts of the ORSA that I've led quite a number of companies through is the idea of doing a number of stress tests, and I think of doing 3 sets of stress tests actually, and they may not be the same things on all 3 sets, but looking at one set of stress tests that are looking at what I call normal volatility, meaning the amount of variation you'd get for a factor in a sort of normal 5 or 10 year period. And then the second thing I look at are realistic disaster scenarios. And those, I like to talk of those, since a lot of times I'm talking to people that aren't mathematicians or actuaries. I say, well, this is a risk that you'd expect to happen once in your career. Not in your lifetime, once in your career. So that's a good bit shorter time than in your lifetime. And frankly, that's about as severe as most managers, most executives ever want to think. Then there's the other risks, and I just call those worst case scenarios. And I've gotten a lot of pushback on that from technical folks, such as a lot of the folks on the call here, because how do you know that's the worst case? Well, I don't know it's the worst case. It's just a lot worse than the realistic disaster cases, and that's all I really mean by that. And when you look at the risks as they play out there and rank them, it usually falls that a company only has a couple of really dangerous risks. If you have 10 really dangerous risks, I think those of us that do know a little bit of math can figure out that company's not going to be there to pay our consulting bills. So we don't really want to do a lot of work with them if they have 10 risks that could kill them in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. One of the things that I'm seeing with the emerging risk data this year is that, we have one question where we ask about these, do you view emerging risks from a disruption standpoint or from a financial standpoint? I'm starting to look into it and see that the way that they answer other questions is varied based on whether they're more financially looking at risk management or whether they're looking at it from a disruption standpoint. It's interesting to look through that. I haven't gotten far enough to be able to talk about it yet, but that'll be interesting as we go forward. We talked about the regulator from a cash flow testing standpoint and how we could build off of that, but what's the regulator's role in terms of an ORSA? Should you have some type of an elevator speech available and ready to go for the regulator, and how would it be different than what you would give to your management team?
Well, interestingly, I got a chance to do some training of some regulators on ORSA. And one of the key facts that I told all of them was that the ORSA creates a new risk for the regulator. And that risk is that they can't use the excuse that we didn't know. If a company blows up and that company filed an ORSA the year before, the ones that aren't filing an ORSA aren't usually going to be the ones making the headlines. They're smaller companies. So if a company that, it blows up and is in the press, and somebody turns to the regulator and say, well, how could this happen? Weren't you watching? If they got an ORSA report, they got a lot of information that should have helped them to understand that was a danger. So what the purpose of the elevator speech to the regulator is to present the information that tells them that you're not one of the companies that they should be spending their time on, that they don't have enough time to delve deeply into the ORSA report for every single company that files one. They need to delve deeply into the ones that are in danger. So what your elevator speech needs to do, tell that story as to how you prove to yourself and hopefully to them that you're not a company that needs to be watched.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're right. The regulator is going to be most focused on the bigger companies, the ones that if they do go insolvent would create the biggest ripple impact throughout the entire industry. So that's interesting. One other question that I had on your elevator speech, it seems like you run into people who kind of naturally understand risk management and enterprise risk management, and others that it's just this totally foreign concept that it's almost like you're either born with it or you're not born with it, one or the other. I wonder what you think about that. Do you see certain types of people that you don't have to spend nearly as much time explaining what ERM is?
I think it has to do with the person's experience more than anything. And I did a trip once when I was with Standard and Poor's where I was visiting Asia, and I was really concerned because the cultural approach in Asia to communicating things like risk is not amenable to a lot of disclosure. And so I was really worried about, well, how do I have those conversations? And I figured out a question or two that I could ask that everybody answered that got the conversation started, and that was great. And what I noticed was, and I guess this was in like the late 2006, 2007, something like that. So it was about 10 years after the big financial crisis that the Asian markets went through in 1998. And what I found was that some companies were really dedicated to doing ERM and doing it right, just as much as companies in other parts of the world. And some were really dedicated to going through the motions and making sure it didn't bother the people that were doing the real business. And the difference between those was the ones who were really trying to do it right were the companies that just barely survived the Asian financial crisis. And the one manager said to me, I went home one night and I remember going out the door and not knowing whether I'd be allowed to go in the next day or whether the regulators would have taken over the company. And he said I never want to have that feeling again. Having experienced a near fatal accident like that. Those are the and whatever their business is, whatever their position in life is, that those are the people that really get risk management. That the people that have had those dangerous experiences and survived them, so that they know that there's danger and they know that it's possible to survive the danger.
I had a couple of things I wanted to share real quick with in terms of who gets risk management. I did a presentation to a life insurance company board a number of years ago that was a company that their board was farmers. And it was interesting because they were nice enough to bring me in the day before to interact with these folks at dinner and getting to talk with them, and they were very interested in what I was going to be talking about the next day. And so we got had a number of side conversations, and they immediately got enterprise risk management. They'd never heard the term before, but think about what a farmer has to do on a day-to-day basis. Every day it's okay, do I have drought? Do I have too much rain? Do I have my seed in right? Did I plant too early? Did I plant too late? There's something always happening that made it a real natural transition for them to think about enterprise risk management. Just recently, I was teaching an online enterprise risk management class that I've developed for Creighton University. And one of the students in there, just as a side comment in one of the discussion boards, talked about how a single mom has to have so many balls in the air that they thought that they would be a natural person who would get enterprise risk management. And I hadn't really thought about that before, but it made sense to me. So I thought those were kind of interesting, but it kind of comes back to that behavioral side. I think that's something that within risk management we're going to be dealing with, not necessarily behavioral finance, but just behavioral expectations and where things are going in the future.
Sure, I've had the same kind of experience discussing risk management with somebody whose job was to manage inventory for a wholesaler of industrial parts. And they had the price fluctuations to worry about and the idea of how much inventory they wanted to hold, the carrying costs of the inventory, and balancing all those things. And they didn't have a systematic way of dealing with all that, but they did the best that they could. And when I told them about risk management, oh, that'd be a great systematic way of approaching this problem, to put all the information together.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I do a lot with private investing as well. And I've actually written papers on the similarities between value investing and enterprise risk management, where you're looking at the same types of things. You have both opportunities and risks, downside and upside, and how do you balance all that and optimize it. I've always been challenged to build a generalized elevator speech about enterprise risk management, but there's great value to an insurer based on the key points of their own ORSA filing. Focus on solvency risks that may only occur once in your career using concepts familiar to the receiver. We talk about not getting lost in the weeds, and this is a great example. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Crossing Thin Ice. If you found it valuable, please like, subscribe, and share with your colleagues.